All right, welcome back, everyone, into the Right Now studio. I am Chris Gros, joined here by Jack Hall. We're having a little bit of a reset here. We just got done talking about Working for Kids, the great fundraiser that we had just yesterday, but now we are going to dive into the news of the day and a lot of the headlines that we have going on here. We are going to start here. This is one of our top stories here this morning, our Tori Apodaca, who is on it. We are learning sort of the true number of arrests by ICE here in San Diego, but also across the nation, and they are hitting record numbers. The new data shows that ICE arrested nearly 2,000 people in San Diego and Imperial counties in July. That's the most we have seen in a single month during President Donald Trump's second term, a 50% increase from June. On Wednesday, dozens of community members marched through the streets in Linda Vista in a show of solidarity for those who have been detained, and arrested by ICE. That includes a 26-year-old man who goes by Caesar, a local father detained in this park that you see here. You see his image there being held by many of those protesting. He was detained back in April. He was deported and then subsequently died. ICE agents have also been busy nationwide. Numbers from the Data Deportation Project show ICE made nearly 50,000 arrests across the U.S. in July, a 15% jump from the number of arrests in June. 20,000 of those arrests were in Texas and Florida alone. People locally say they don't want people to forget that this is still happening in our neighborhoods. Witnesses who asked to stay anonymous tell us that they saw what appear to be Border Patrol Tactical Unit, an elite, highly militarized tactical response group within U.S. Customs and Border Protection, making an arrest in Leucadia Shopping Center just last week. We at News 8 asked ICE for more information about this, but have not since heard back. And Jack, I think that what this story does is sort of bridges the gap between what we saw take place in the winter. And of course, I know a lot of attention paid to in Minnesota. That was seemingly the boiling point with these immigration tactics. But you can even go back to last year in South Park when we saw that heavily militarized unit doing an immigration raid at a local restaurant, Buena Forqueta. And I think the images versus the numbers is a very powerful tool to explain here. And what I mean by that is, I think for a lot of folks, and what these protesters and these advocates are saying, is that just because we are not maybe seeing these high-profile videos going through the news cycle as much anymore does not mean that these arrests are not happening still.
I would say that the agenda of the administration is consistent, and we're going to be consistent, too, in our messaging that we don't believe this is right. We still believe in the American dream, and we especially believe in the dignity of all people.
We've seen this in other cities, so to see it here was really startling.
And, that is a great thing that underscores your point there, those comments that you made, is because that's kind of been what we've seen here is, I would say, consistency. This really is not only a updated snapshot of what we're seeing out of immigration enforcement, whether that's Customs and Border Patrol or whether that is ICE in particular, or whether that's local authorities who are assisting those federal agencies in this immigration enforcement operation and this agenda that we're seeing the Trump administration play out. But it really is a difference between the Kristi Noem-led DHS and the Markwayne Mullin-led DHS, because you mentioned Minnesota, you mentioned South Park, you mentioned a lot of these instances in the early half of what we would say is, the first half of the Trump administration, so the first quarter of the Trump administration, which is, it seemed as such that the showmanship was at high. And I don't mean to say that in like a vindictive way.
Greg Bavino, by the way,
that.
who was sort of also, he's another character in this that has been, he would tell you that he retired back to the El Centro region, and I think he actually has since retired.
Yes,
but many people
reported
him as being fired, essentially.
And of course, there's been the reports about the money that Kristi Noem had put into the advertising campaigns.
Correct. Yeah,
and it did
versus
feel
enforcement.
Enforcement, and it did feel like you see that shift where it was more about the publicity aspect of the Noem-led agency, whereas Markwayne Mullin is operating it in a much more low-key way.
Yeah.
It's and we'll check the numbers here. they are at higher levels than
Yeah.
we saw with Kristi Noem, but it's being done in a way where, you're not seeing these instances that are creating the immense public backlash. Because remember what we saw out of Minnesota, and one of the results that we got was Mark Wayne Mullen during those confirmation hearings, conceding some points and making some sort of concessions. Now the concessions and the scope of those concessions is a completely different debate within itself, and we can have that conversation at a later point. I'm talking about body cameras. How much is going to be shown? How much is the public going to have access to? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, that is a concession that was made due to these mass operations that we were seeing in localized areas that became flashpoints for this immigration agenda.
Yeah, and it could be, and this was something that we also heard during these confirmation hearings, where essentially there were sort of like, and this is what was happening in Minneapolis. We were essentially seeing like roaming patrols of these sort of militarized tactical units, approaching individuals, or in some cases having operations or targeted enforcement. But then there would be people who would not necessarily be a target of that enforcement that would then be wrapped up, or it would create, a much more of a scene. And, you had these advocacy groups who were kind of following these very visual groups that were going around as part of the enforcement. And it's my understanding that under Mark Wayne Mullen, it's not as if they are not going at, and we'll get into who these people are, or at least maybe what are some of the details about who it is that is being arrested, detained, and so forth. But they're not. They're doing it a little bit more targeted versus these sort of roundups, if you will, or like casting a wide net. They are trying to be more efficient, and again, it appears by all means with the numbers that they are much more efficient. I mean, you're talking about a 50% increase month to month. That's a huge amount.
Yeah, this morning the New York Times did a good breakdown, and we're going to be citing the New York Times in some of these numbers that we're going to give you. A good analysis of the numbers that we're seeing getting reported by the Data Deportation Project. But there's quoted here, a former senior ICE official is telling the New York Times, quote, "They have more officers, more money, more detention space, more local partners, and better systems." She continues to say, and they're finally putting all the pieces together to build out this deportation machine. And I think that is the big takeaway before we get into those numbers, is that the president during the campaign had said this is going to be the largest mass deportation operation in U.S. history. And those are lofty goals. And at the beginning of the administration, we saw them struggle to even reach numbers that the Biden administration has. I'm talking about a rolling daily average. There were days in which they were not doing it. The system that was being envisioned on the early side being put in place was, I think it's fair to say, and I think even the president would tell you this, janky. It didn't seem to have the cohesion that we see now. Of course, we're not seeing it in the headlines as much as we're seeing it because, like we mentioned, it seemed as if they were trying to do a lot in such a little time, and that became the epicenter of a public conversation. It is still a public conversation. You see that there in the sound that we showed you. It's not like this conversation has gone away, but the tenor of the conversation has changed. This isn't this national story where, you have the title of the operation. This is Operation Midway Blitz, and we're going into Chicago, and we're going into Minnesota, and we're conducting these mass things. This is much more tactical. This is much more spread out. And as you see in the numbers, it's incredibly successful here for the agency.
And remember, I believe it was White House. I'm trying to remember his official title, but White House as chief advisor, maybe senior advisor, Stephen Miller. He's sort of the author of the quota, so to speak, that has been going on for again, for a lot of these numbers that have been. And there's also been reporting from the beginning of the term, his frustration because we're going to get into this in just a little bit. During the campaign, when we were hearing President Trump again really take the Biden administration to heart for the issues that were going on at the border, all of these, sometimes accurate claims, sometimes very wild claims about who these people are. The sort of whether or not it was intentional or unintentional, but the use of the insane asylum when we're talking about people claiming asylum and so forth, and by President Trump and whatnot. It was promised that it was going to be those who were let into the country that should not have been let in, right? Those who with criminal history. But as we've seen, And this did sort of take place in the beginning of the Trump administration. You did see people who did not have a criminal history get wrapped up in a lot of these ICE immigration enforcements. And that is something we've heard locally across the nation and so forth. That's what a lot of people were protesting. But now you're seeing it really begin to go even beyond just the folks without criminal history. So, you mentioned the 2,000 immigration arrests per day. That's the goal. But these arrests have now expanded to groups that were not previously part of that campaign promise. We're talking about those married to U.S. citizens. There was a prominent Republican donor, I believe from Texas, who was just recently, recounting the fact that I believe it was his fiance, who was in the country with him, and I believe her visa had either expired or she was in between. She was wrapped up. She was taken away. And there was this interview that he did with CBS News where he's like, I didn't think it would happen to me. You're hearing a lot of that, right? Spouses of those.
A lot of voters as
well. A lot of voters.
Trump voters,
Trump
too.
voters, like 3-time Trump voters who are now either family members or spouses who are being wrapped up in a lot of this Trump deportation policy that all of a sudden now are kind of calling out and saying, hey, look, I thought we were going to go after the bad guys. And that has been a huge sort of turn of strategy, if you will, with this. And I think that that's really been sort of the focal point of why we're seeing these numbers begin to blow up like this.
Yeah, and blowing up is definitely the right word here. So when Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen was confirmed earlier in the year, now there was a natural dip, not a major dip in the numbers of the detainees and all that. But of course, as we outlined earlier in this segment, it was a fraught time for the agency and the Department of Homeland Security at that time. And there's this flux that they were in at that point. But the 7-day rolling average of ICE arrests for detainees with no criminal record in specific was around 350 to 400 a day. Again, that's a 7-day rolling average. Since the beginning of July, it stayed above 750. And even for a few moments, for a few weeks, a few days, it was peaking at above 1,000. So we talk about that 2,000 a day goal. There have been instances, albeit brief, but the level still remains elevated, where over half of the goal that President Trump has set out for his agencies that enforce immigration have been those without a criminal record of any sort. So, and then we also see now that the share of detainees with a past violent criminal conviction has fallen to under 4%. Yeah. Now, before we get into that 4% number, it's important to note that most undocumented immigrants here in this country do not have a violent criminal record. It has been a vast minority of those to begin with.
This has been the talking point, though, of, in particular, Stephen Miller, when he does these interviews on cable television, is what he will tell you is that everyone who is here illegally is thus a criminal. And so that is sort of the workaround about how they get, because they are pressed, they're asked about these numbers. And what they will tell you is, or what he will tell you, and he has been quoted on this, is that he essentially will say that those who are here undocumented are commit that being here illegally by virtue of just being here undocumented, that they believe that is an illegal act and that is a criminal act. And so he has really been reportedly, again, a lot of reporting has been done on this by the New York Times and such, that he has been, again, the one who has been pushing for it to go beyond what many people, what many voters, what many folks on the street will interpret as a violent criminal history. And essentially, he's made the reference of, like, if you allow someone who's already broken the law to get into this country, what's to stop? What makes you think they won't continue to break the law?
And
that's their defense of this.
And to expand on your point, you've made this point a few times that illegally entering the country, that's a criminal act. But if you have a visa, if you have an asylum claim, temporary protected status that expires, that's a civil offense.
Yes.
So when we, just to be clear here on the law, there are many instances in which people are here illegally, but that is
those
too big of an
overstay,
umbrella term to describe.
And I believe it's a misdemeanor even to just like cross the border illegally without any type of status or anything like that, it does not rise to the level of like a felony. I do not believe. Now, you could be deported, of course.
Yeah.
But I believe it's a misdemeanor. It's not a violent criminal act.
Yes. So let's talk about the hotspots.
Yeah.
San Diego is one of them. Almost every state, to be fair, has reached all-time highs. San Diego, along with El Paso, San Antonio, and the Harlingen regions. Of course, we're talking about Texas here. You don't see the same thing in New Mexico. You don't see the same thing in Arizona as much. I think that is much more of a regional and a climate based reason, because of course these are all border areas. So you're going to see these numbers be elevated in comparison to the rest of the country, albeit that still remains that most of the states are still at all-time highs. This just happens to be where you are seeing these operations take place in particular. So the San Diego area right now, you heard the numbers from Tori in our morning shows. You heard Chris say it earlier, seeing upwards of 36 arrests per 100,000 residents, compared to the rest of the state, where those other regions are about 6 to 12 per 100,000 for the rest of the state. So San Diego is seeing immigration enforcement at the least threefold.
Yeah.
What you're seeing in the rest of the state. You know,
Which is,
at the high end, that's 12 per 100,000. For us, 36 per 100,000 is the low end.
Yeah, but still enough to make, the national headlines, so to speak.
Yes.
But as you said, I wonder if the difference here is, as we're about to get into, is that local cooperation? Like, is that the difference? I do truly wonder. Obviously, I think there's always the assumption that us being directly on the border, and obviously there are huge swaths of Texas that are on the border as well too. Florida has its own, not issues I would say, but its own sort of details that have to deal with
circumstances
cross Atlantic migration, things like that. You could look at Florida and essentially say it shares a border with the rest of the country, being that it's a peninsula with open water there. But I do wonder that local cooperation, which has increased in a number of areas, Jack, if that could be a potential reason why we are not seeing it rise to the level of those other countries, or excuse me, other states, as you have said, other areas.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is, we are at these elevated rates. We are one of the areas that are leading the nation, and we're doing it without local cooperation. But that's a good way to explain it in a lot of other areas, though. So just for the sake of, breaking it down, because this is an important data point here, where even though it's not particular to us here in San Diego, I think it's important to mention nonetheless. The first off, the agent population of ICE. They have recruited more than 8,000 extra agents since the beginning of the Trump administration. That's something that we've talked about. They've offered signing bonuses and whatnot. You have seen the effort in some way, shape, or form, whether that's on your phone, whether that's on television, to ramp up the recruitment and to ramp up the body population of this agency and its enforcement officer population. But they're also expanding a program over the past 18 months or so that has utilized local police officers in immigration enforcement operations. This program is called 289G, and it is becoming a more and more sought after method of conducting immigration enforcement at this scale. So the latest numbers that we have here show that, if you give me just one moment so I can scroll down and I can find the data. Yes. So right here, as of right now, 287G detainments make up 14% of all immigration arrests. It was essentially the tiniest, almost a non-detectable blip at the start of the Trump administration. They had been relying almost primarily on ICE and other, federal immigration enforcement agencies. We talk about CBP, et cetera, to conduct this. But you are seeing certain states really take charge here and cooperating with them. We talked about Texas. We've talked about Florida. These are states that have had upwards of 500 immigration-related detainments a day. Now, that's a quarter of the federal mandate that President Trump wants his agencies to meet. And a lot of that has to do with the leadership. Governors Greg Abbott, Governor Ron DeSantis, of course, have been in lockstep with the Trump administration in terms of their immigration enforcement operations. I covered the first, few months or so of the Trump administration. I heard the comments from Ron DeSantis back when I was in Florida, pledge this alliance between him and the sheriff's departments, the counties, most of the counties, to be fair, and the Trump administration. So, you're seeing this take place, and they're one of the places that are really leading the charge. That makes a huge chunk of that. And then you look at a state like, let's say, for example, West Virginia. West Virginia does not have the federal resources that you would see a Texas or you would see a Florida have. So, in a state like West Virginia, they're almost relying exclusively
on this
local
287G,
authorities in the
right.
287G
Yeah.
program to conduct it on behalf of ICE because their
yeah.
presence is just, essentially non-existent there.
And again, with West Virginia, you don't see the political makeup to put something in place to sort of outlaw that cooperation.
Yes.
Now, obviously here in San Diego, we know very well that there has been a lot of internal conflict, specifically with San Diego County, about the level of extent that there would be cooperation. We know Sheriff Kelly Martinez and the San Diego County Board of Supervisors, that's been a topic of conversation. To what extent can they cooperate, and to what extent is it a violation of what the county has put in place? We know the city of San Diego and the city police department has very adamantly been saying that they do not cooperate with immigration enforcement, including with the very controversial use of flock cameras, which advocates here in this area for immigration services, but then also some of them are also the opponents of these flock cameras, insist that there have been leaks and or potential maybe unaware of some of the sharing of data potentially when it comes to open federal immigration cases. That's been a dispute there. But you're not seeing outright 287G cooperation, which I think is in large part because of a lot of what the local leaders here on this level have put into place to sort of set the standard for what will be allowed by local law enforcement. And of course, those are just the two largest law enforcement operations that we have here. We know obviously, each and every city has its own either police department or contract with the sheriff department in some form.
We know Imperial County,
Yeah.
as the county at least, doesn't have a 287G contract with the federal government, and we are including Imperial County when we're having this conversation.
That's part of our larger
about the San Diego
market area.
region in particular. So we're one of the highest. We have one of the highest propensities of ICE detainments here in the country. What separates us from the El Paso region, the San Antonio region, and these are big regions. We're just using that as the base point to kind of describe the larger area. The Harlingen region in Texas, all border regions, this is being done entirely by the federal government and the federal agencies here. So, obviously a lot of that has to do with location, but to, just to give you guys an idea of what these numbers really mean. So to put a bow in it, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Markwayne Mullin, has made a pledge to Congress that what we saw during the Nome-led era of DHS was not going to be the same thing that you would see under his leadership. And a lot of that, as was promised to Congress, had to do with addressing some of those concerns and making some real concessions. But nonetheless, those concessions pale in comparison to what we see now as the department's goal of maintaining this mandate that was sent here by the president. And as the looks of it, they're as close to reaching that mandate from President Trump as much as Kristi Noem had ever done at this point.
Yeah, and I do think that there needs to be a differentiation between again what it is that we are saying when we talk again about optics and numbers. Again, when Markwayne Mullin was confirmed, a large part of the conversation was not about ceasing immigration operations and enforcement. A lot of it was, again, about Renee Good and Alex Preddy, two American citizens who were killed in these protests by, again, Department of Homeland Security. I'm going to say federal law enforcement officers because, again, there is a difference between ICE and CBP. And again, I don't want to mistakenly identify which agency. So I'll say Department of Homeland Security law enforcement officers, right? And that was a large part of the confirmation hearings. Large part of the answers, including from Republican senators, was will American citizens, with your type of operation strategy, will we see them be sort of in the line of fire again? That's a large portion of the conversation when it comes to the body cameras and so forth. But I do think that for people who thought that under Markwayne Mullin we were going to see less immigration operations, I think what you'll see here is that essentially what I'm trying to say is that the stats don't back that up, right? That in fact that it was not going to be a less enforcement, if anything. It was going to be a less violent enforcement potentially.
And this is perhaps the best chance, if you are Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen of reaching this goal, because everything that we're mentioning here when it comes to these hot button issues are going to be roped into the context of the upcoming midterms. You take a look at what people are expecting. We saw Jared Kushner met with Hakeem Jeffries. Is that a sign that the administration is already making plans for a House Speaker Jeffries situation? So we do know that the party in power typically loses seats in an off-year election cycle. So the agency is going to need to make preparations for what the next Congress could look like, because it very well could be with a Democrat sitting in the chair that Mike Johnson is right now. So, that means increased oversight. That means increased appearances to the House committees and to the Senate committees, even if, Democrats take the Senate, which, seemed like a long shot at some point. But now, while it's still probably unlikely, I think is the correct way to work at it, it's something to consider nonetheless.
Nonetheless, it's still something to consider. I don't want to get into another topic, but I'm hearing a lot of analysis, or a lot of opinions, I should say, which we shouldn't confuse those two, about that meeting that you just mentioned with Jeffries and
no one likes it.
And no one likes it. So I think we should not get ahead of ourselves at Hakeem Jeffries. And I'm not saying you were, but by all intents and purposes, he obviously is the favorite if Democrats win the House to become House Speaker. However, crazier things have happened, especially if we see the DSA candidates make up a large chunk of a Democratic majority. The DSA candidates are not in favor of Hakeem Jeffries.
Or at least, a size of what you see in the Freedom Caucus.
Correct.
Because the Freedom Caucus
is not fans of Mike Johnson.
Gives Mike Johnson headaches all the time.
And we saw how hard it was for Mike Johnson to get confirmed as House Speaker. So I'm just saying, could we potentially have a situation like that here with Hakeem Jeffries?
That could be the case.
Another conversation, but the political junkie started coming out.
I think well, and we got we're in this weird flux where we got a little bit of time to kill, because we might not have enough time for a full segment, but we still want to have a conversation. Yeah. But I mean, I guess, the point I'm trying to make at that point is, we talk about the rhetoric of the Trump administration. We talk about the goals in, President Trump and his administration. They want to, oftentimes they try to advertise themselves as these strong men who can strong arm, and oftentimes they can, whether that's in trade, whether that's with, of course, reconstruction projects, renovation projects, things that critics of the Trump administration and critics of Congress say it leaves them feckless. However, this is a situation when you have a majority in either chamber of Congress, that is a significant political advantage that you have at that point. So that there comes a point where realpolitik kicks in. This is, if President Trump wants to get the rest of his agenda, or at least parts of it, completed, if you see Hakeem Jeffries or just a Democrat that's sitting there in the House speakership, you're going to have to play hardball with them to a certain extent. So that's why we see these conversations. But that's not the case right now. Mm-hmm. This is still Mike Johnson's House. This is still Senator John Thune's Senate. They have all the tools to complete this agenda. So you're seeing it happen now. Is this their best chance, if you're looking at it from the perspective of ICE and you're looking at it from the perspective of the Immigration Enforcement Task Force that has been created here to fulfill President Trump's agenda? Are you going to be able to see this time next year? Those are going to be the questions we're going to have to ask ourselves.
Bunch of questions here.